Looking back, I never imagined that one innocent visit would unravel the boundaries we thought could never be crossed. That summer, everything changed between me and my nephew. What began as an ordinary visit from my nephew turned into something far more complicated, stirring emotions I never expected. We had always shared a close bond, but this time things felt different, charged, as if an unspoken connection was brewing just beneath the surface. The lines between family and something more blurred in ways I couldn't explain, and as the days passed, I found myself pulled deeper into feelings I hadn't anticipated. What was supposed to be a simple, carefree time together became a journey neither of us could have foreseen, a journey that would forever alter the way we saw each other and ourselves. I never thought that I'd find myself in such a situation, lying awake with a mixture of emotions that I hadn't felt in a long time. My nephew had grown up right before my eyes. I still remember the young boy running through the backyard, his laugh contagious, full of innocence. Now that same boy was a young man, taller than me, more confident than I ever expected, and somehow that confidence made me more aware of him in a way that I couldn't explain. The day he arrived at my house, suitcase in hand, I thought nothing of it. He was just spending the summer with me, like he had before. But this time was different. He wasn't the boy I used to know. The way he carried himself, the way he looked at me when we spoke, it was like I was seeing him for the first time, and something about it unnerved me, but it also intrigued me. At first we spent our days like we always had, playing video games, watching movies, and talking late into the night. It felt normal, almost too normal. But then came that night, the night he asked if he could sleep in my room. "It's just for a few nights, Uncle," he'd said with that boyish grin I could never say no to. "I've been having trouble sleeping, and it's always easier when I'm with you." How could I refuse? I'd always been his safe place, the one he came to when things were tough, the one he trusted without question. So I said yes, thinking nothing of it. But when the lights went out and I lay there in the dark, his steady breathing filling the room, I realized something had changed. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I became more aware of his presence, of the fact that he was just a few feet away, that if I reached out I could touch him, but I couldn't. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering why everything felt so different now. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to ignore the thoughts creeping into my mind, but it was impossible. The way he smiled at me, the way he laughed at my jokes, it all felt charged with something I couldn't quite define. It wasn't just familial love anymore. There was something more, something that made my heart race and my palms sweat when he was near. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking it. But every night when he slipped into my room and settled into the bed beside me, I felt that pull again, that quiet, undeniable connection between us that had grown stronger with each passing day. One night, as we sat on the porch after dinner, talking about everything and nothing, he turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. There was a softness in his eyes, something unspoken that lingered in the air between us. "Uncle," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "do you ever feel like we're more than just family?" His question caught me off guard. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. He shrugged, looking away as if embarrassed. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like there's something more between us, like I can't explain it, but it's there." My heart raced. I wanted to say something, to tell him he was imagining things, that it was just a phase, but I couldn't find the words, because deep down I felt it too. There was something between us, something unspoken, something that had been growing for weeks, maybe even longer. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you're just tired. We've spent a lot of time together." He didn't push the subject, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. That night as we lay in the dark once again, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. I could feel him shifting in the bed beside me, restless. I knew he was thinking about our conversation just as I was. I could feel the tension in the air, the way it crackled between us, like a storm waiting to break. I turned over, facing him in the darkness. "Are you awake?" I whispered. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely audible. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Uncle, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different? If we weren't related?" His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell him I had never thought about it. But that would be a lie. I had wondered what it would be like if we weren't bound by the rules of family, if we could explore this thing between us without guilt or shame. "I don't know," I said finally. "I guess I've thought about it." There was another long silence, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, louder than the quiet night around us. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that things were about to change. There was no going back now. We had crossed a line, and there was no pretending it didn't exist anymore. But the story didn't end there. It was the morning after that strange conversation, and everything felt different. I could feel it the moment I opened my eyes. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the fan spinning lazily overhead. But my mind was racing. He was still asleep, his back turned to me. And for a second I wondered if it had all been a dream, a fleeting thought that vanished as soon as I remembered his words from the night before. We hadn't crossed any physical boundaries, but something had shifted between us, a subtle but undeniable change. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface was now palpable, hanging over us like a cloud we couldn't escape. Every glance, every word seemed to carry an unspoken weight, and I didn't know what to do with it. I got out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb him, and made my way to the kitchen. As I stood there waiting for the coffee to brew, my mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. His voice, soft but insistent, asking me if things could be different between us. And the worst part, I hadn't been able to deny it. I had admitted, if only to myself, that I had thought about it, that there was a part of me that wanted something more, something I knew was forbidden. The sound of footsteps behind me snapped me out of my thoughts, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. But even that simple greeting felt loaded with meaning now, like there was something hidden beneath the surface of every word. He walked over to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee, and for a few moments we stood there in silence, the tension between us growing thicker with each passing second. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't dare look at him. I wasn't ready to face whatever it was that we had unleashed last night. Finally, he broke the silence. "About last night," he began, his voice cautious. I didn't mean to make things weird. I shook my head quickly, maybe too quickly. "It's fine," I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "We were just talking, nothing to worry about." But I could tell he didn't believe me. And why should he? I didn't believe myself. "I don't want things to change between us," he continued, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. "I mean, I know they kind of already have, but I don't want to lose what we have." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't want to lose what we had either. But how could we show that everything was the same when it wasn't? The very nature of our relationship had shifted, and there was no going back. We couldn't unhear the things we had said, couldn't unfeel the things we had felt. "I don't want to lose it either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But things are different now." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yeah, they are." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. I could feel the distance growing between us, even as we stood just a few feet apart. And I hated it. I hated that this thing, whatever it was coming between us. But I didn't know how to stop it. For the rest of the day, we went through the motions, trying to act like nothing had changed, but the tension never left. It was there in every conversation, in every shared glance. And the more we tried to ignore it, the more it consumed us. That night, after another awkward dinner, we found ourselves sitting on the couch, watching a movie in silence. It was something we used to do all the time, but now it felt like we were just going through the motions, trying to fill the space between us with meaningless distractions. I could feel him beside me, close enough that our arms occasionally brushed against each other, and each time it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind kept drifting back to that conversation, to the way it looked at me, the way his voice had sounded when he asked if things could be different. Could they? I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that being near him, even like this, was driving me insane. Every little movement, every quiet sigh, felt charged with a meaning I couldn't quite define. And I knew he felt it too. I could see it in the way he shifted uncomfortably, the way he avoided looking directly at me. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I turned to him. We need to talk. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. About what? You know about what, I said, my voice more tense than I intended. We can't keep pretending that everything's fine. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his gaze intense, like he was searching for something in my face. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. Yeah, you're right, he said quietly. We can't. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. I don't know what to do with this, I admitted finally. I don't know how to handle it. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I don't either. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on us. And then, without warning, he reached out and placed his hand on mine. The gesture was so simple, so innocent, but it sent a shockwave through me. I froze, unsure what to do, unsure of how to react. I know this is complicated, he said softly, but I need you to know that I care about you more than I probably should. His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was it. The thing we had been avoiding, the thing that had been hovering between us for weeks. And now there it was, out in the open, impossible to ignore. I care about you too, I admitted, my voice barely audible. But this, it's not right. He pulled his hand back. His expression hurt. Why isn't it right? We're both adults. We can make our own choices. I shook my head, trying to make sense of everything. It's not that simple. Why not? His voice was more insistent now, more desperate. Why can't it be that simple? Because it wasn't. Because there were lines you didn't cross, even if you wanted to. Because this was my nephew, and no matter how much I cared about him, no matter how much I wanted to give in to whatever this was, I couldn't. I don't know, I said finally, the words catching in my throat. I don't know. His words echoed the very thing I had been feeling for weeks, but I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to tell him that I felt the same way, that I didn't know how to be around him either, that this thing between us was pulling me in just as much as it was pulling him. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't give voice to the feelings that had been building inside me, the feelings I knew were wrong, but that I couldn't seem to shake. So instead I said nothing. The tension between us was unbearable. Every glance, every word seemed to push us closer to a boundary we both knew we shouldn't cross. Yet neither of us could pull away. It had been building for weeks, maybe even months, and now it felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't undo. That night the air was thick with humidity, making the small room feel even more claustrophobic. We were both in bed, the silence between us louder than the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I turned over, unable to sleep, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened over the past few days. It was impossible. There was no logic to it, no easy explanation for why I felt the way I did. He was my nephew. I had practically helped raise him. But now all of that seemed distant and irrelevant. What mattered was the way he made me feel, like I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. I heard him shift in the bed beside me, his movements quiet but enough to break the silence. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep, but I knew he could sense the tension just as much as I could. "Are you awake?" he whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the stillness of the room. I didn't answer at first, unsure of what to say, but eventually I nodded. Yeah, I am. There was a pause, and then I felt him move closer. The bed creaked under his weight as he shifted, until he was lying right next to me. Our bodies almost touching, but not quite. I can't stop thinking about it, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. About us. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This was it. The moment we had both been avoiding. The moment we knew would change everything. I know, I whispered back, my voice trembling slightly. I've been thinking about it too. His hand reached out, hesitating for just a second before resting lightly on my arm. I turned to face him, and in the dim light, I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict I was feeling. At this time, the only thing that mattered was the way he was looking at me, the way his hand felt against my skin, the way my heart was pounding in my chest. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in. Our faces were inches apart, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, without thinking, I closed the gap. Our lips met in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative. But it quickly deepened as all the emotions we had been holding back for so long came rushing to the surface. It was like a floodgate had opened. All the hesitation, all the uncertainty melted away as the kiss grew more passionate, more urgent. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to stop him. The kiss intensified, and soon it wasn't just about the kiss anymore. His hands roamed over my body, exploring, and I did the same, my fingers tracing the contours of his chest, his arms, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. We didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary, redundant. Everything we had been feeling, the confusion, the desire, the guilt, was communicated through our actions. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about the consequences. I stopped worrying about what this meant, about what would happen tomorrow, and just let myself feel. It had been so long since anyone had touched me like this, and the fact that it was made it even more intense. I arched into his touch, and he responded by pulling me even closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing growing ragged as the moment built, as the tension between us reached its peak. This was happening. We were crossing the line, and there was no going back. And yet, in that moment, I didn't care. Everything happened in a blur after that. Clothes were discarded. Hands roamed freely. And soon we were both lying there exposed, vulnerable. But neither of us pulled away. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with an intensity one hadn't expected. Every touch, every kiss was a silent confession, a way of expressing what words couldn't. And as we moved together, as our bodies found a rhythm, I realized that this was more than just physical. This was a culmination of everything we had been feeling for so long, but had been too afraid to admit. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, lost in each other, the world outside forgotten. And when it was over, when we were both lying there in the aftermath, breathing heavily, our bodies tangled together, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I turned to look at him, and he was already staring at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite read. There was desire there, yes, but also something deeper, something more complicated. He didn't say anything after that, and neither did I. We just lay there, side by side, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. The intimacy we had shared had been more than I had ever expected, more than I had been prepared for. And yet, as wrong as it was, as complicated as it had become, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The silence in the room was overwhelming. We lay there, tangled in the aftermath of everything that had happened between us. My thoughts were scattered, emotions spinning in ways I couldn't control or comprehend. For a long time, neither of us moved. The weight of what we'd done pressed down on both of us, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The silence stretched on until finally I couldn't bear it anymore. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, almost afraid of breaking the stillness. He didn't look at me right away, his jaw tightening before he answered. "I think so," he said, his voice low, but everything feels different now. His words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just him who felt it. Everything was different. The tension that had been between us for so long had finally snapped, and now we were left with the pieces. I wasn't sure if we could put them back together or if we even should. I pulled the blanket around myself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. "We can't pretend like nothing happened," I said, my throat tightening as I spoke. "We crossed the line." He nodded, still staring at the ceiling, as if the answers to everything were written in the shadows above us. But what are we supposed to do now? That was the question, wasn't it? We had shared something we shouldn't have, something that was never meant to happen, and yet here we were, caught in the mess of our own making. My mind raced, searching for a solution, for a way to move forward without completely unraveling everything we had built. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what happens next." At this time, the only thing that mattered was the way he was looking at me, the way his hand felt against my skin, the way my heart was pounding in my chest. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in. Our faces were inches apart, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, without thinking, I closed the gap. Our lips met in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened as all the emotions we had been holding back for so long came rushing to the surface. It was like a floodgate had opened. All the hesitation, all the uncertainty melted away as the kiss grew more passionate, more urgent. His hands moved my back, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to stop him. The kiss intensified, and soon it wasn't just about the kiss anymore. His hands roamed over my body, exploring, and I did the same, my fingers tracing the contours of his chest, his arms, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. We didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary, redundant. Everything we had been feeling, the confusion, the desire, the guilt, was communicated through our actions. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about the consequences. I stopped worrying about what this meant, about what would happen tomorrow, and just let myself feel. It had been so long since anyone had touched me like this, and the fact that it wasn't made it even more intense. I arched into his touch, and he responded by pulling me even closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing growing ragged as the moment built, as the tension between us reached its peak. This was happening. We were crossing the line, and there was no going back. And yet, in that moment, I didn't care. Everything happened in a blur after that. Clothes were discarded, hands roamed freely, and soon we were both lying there, exposed, vulnerable, but neither of us pulled away. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with an intensity one hadn't expected. Every touch, every kiss was a silent confession, a way of expressing what words couldn't. And as we moved together, as our bodies found a rhythm, I realized that this was more than just physical. This was a culmination of everything we had been feeling for so long, but had been too afraid to admit. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, lost in each other, the world outside forgotten. And when it was over, when we were both lying there in the aftermath, breathing heavily, our bodies tangled together, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I turned to look at him, and he was already staring at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite read. There was desire there, yes, but also something deeper, something more complicated. He didn't say anything after that, and neither did I. We just lay there, side by side, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. The intimacy we had shared had been more than I had ever expected, more than I had been prepared for. And yet, as wrong as it was, as complicated as it had become, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The silence in the room was overwhelming. We lay there, tangled in the aftermath of everything that had happened between us. My thoughts were scattered, emotions spinning in ways I couldn't control or comprehend. For a long time, neither of us moved. The weight of what we'd done pressed down on both of us, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The silence stretched on until finally I couldn't bear it anymore. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, almost afraid of breaking the stillness. He didn't look at me right away, his jaw tightening before he answered. "I think so," he said, his voice low, "but everything feels different now." His words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just him who felt it. Everything was different. The tension that had been between us for so long had finally snapped, and now we were left with the pieces. I wasn't sure if we could put them back together or if we even should. I pulled the blanket around myself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. "We can't pretend like nothing happened," I said, my throat tightening as I spoke. "We crossed the line." He nodded, still staring at the ceiling, as if the answers to everything were written in the shadows above us. "I know," he murmured, "but what are we supposed to do now?" That was the question, wasn't it? We had shared something we shouldn't have, something that was never meant to happen, and yet here we were, caught in the mess of our own making. My mind raced, searching for a solution, for a way to move forward without completely unraveling everything we had built. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what happens next." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes full of uncertainty. "Do you regret it?" he asked, the words hanging in the air between us, heavier than anything else he could have said. I hesitated, trying to find the truth in the chaos of my thoughts. Regret wasn't the right word. What I felt was more complicated than that. It was a mix of emotions, desire, fear, guilt, all tangled together in a knot that I couldn't easily unravel. "I don't regret it," I said quietly after a long pause, "but I don't know what to do with it. I think we need some time," I said eventually, my voice breaking the silence. "We can't just keep going like this. We need to figure out what we want and what this means for both of us." He didn't respond right away, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched into fists under the blanket. He didn't want space, neither did I, if I was being honest. But we both knew that this wasn't something we could just dive into without thinking about the consequences. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "You're right," he said, though his voice was filled with reluctance. "But that doesn't make it easier." "No," I agreed, my chest tightening. "It doesn't." We spent the next few days in an uneasy truce, avoiding the conversation that we both knew was inevitable. He stayed, but there was a distance between us now, a barrier that neither of us could seem to cross. Every glance, every touch was filled with the knowledge of what had happened and the fear of what it meant for the future. On the last day before he was set to leave, I found him sitting outside on the porch, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything, but the beauty of the moment felt hollow. I walked over to him, hesitating for a moment before sitting down beside him. "You're leaving tomorrow," I said, more of a statement than a question. He nodded, not looking at me. "Yeah." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, "for everything, for making this more complicated than it had to be." He finally turned to face me, his expression softening. "Don't apologize," he said, shaking his head. "We both knew what we were getting into. I didn't expect it to feel like this." "Like what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Like it's over before it even started," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Like we never even had a chance to figure out what we wanted." The sadness in his voice broke something inside me, but I didn't know how to fix it. He was right. We hadn't given ourselves a chance to figure out what we wanted, because we had been too afraid of the consequences, too afraid of what it meant to feel the way we did. "I don't know if we ever could have had a chance," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we were always meant to end up here." He didn't respond right away, just stared at me for a long moment, as if searching for something in my face. Then he stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice flat. "Maybe this was always going to happen." He walked away, leaving me alone on the porch, the weight of his absence settling over me like a heavy blanket. I watched him go, my heart aching with the knowledge that this was the right decision, even if it was the hardest one to make. The days after he left were some of the loneliest I'd ever experienced. The house felt empty, quieter than it had ever been, and no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't escape the feeling that something vital was missing. The decision to create distance between us had felt right in the moment, but now I wasn't so sure. Was this space what we really needed? Or was it just a way to avoid the truth of how complicated things had become? I threw myself into work, hoping it would help me forget, but it didn't. Every room in the house was a reminder of him, of what we'd shared and the things we'd left unsaid. I would catch myself glancing at my phone, waiting for a message from him, but none came. A few weeks passed, and life slowly moved forward. I tried not to think about him, but it was impossible. He was everywhere, in the memories we had created together, in the silence that had replaced the easy conversations we once had. I didn't know if he was thinking about me too, or if he had managed to move on, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Then one day my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, heart pounding when I saw his name flash across it. My hand hovered over the phone for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let him fade into the background of my life. But the other part, the part that had been missing him every day, couldn't resist. I opened the message. "I've been thinking about us. Can we talk?" The simple text held more weight than any long conversation ever could. He was reaching out, extending an olive branch, and I didn't know if I was ready to take it. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore it, not after everything we had been through. I typed out a quick reply, my hands shaking slightly. "Yeah, let's meet." We arranged to meet at a small cafe, one we had been to many times before. As the day approached, the anticipation grew. I had no idea what to expect, whether this conversation would bring us closer or push us even further apart. But I knew I needed to see him. When the day finally arrived, I sat at a table near the window, my heart racing as I waited. I hadn't seen him in weeks, and the thought of facing him again, of talking about everything that had happened, was both exhilarating and terrifying. Then the door opened, and there he was. He looked the same, but something about him was different. More serious, perhaps, or maybe it was just the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging between us. He walked over to me, a small, hesitant smile on his face. "Hey," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Hey," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence between us thick but not unbearable. It was different this time, less tense, more expectant. "I've been thinking a lot." He began looking down at his hands, about everything that happened, and I realized something. I leaned forward slightly, waiting for him to continue. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know what this means for us or if we can ever figure it out, but I know I don't want us to end like this." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't expected him to say that, hadn't dared to hope that he still felt the same way. But here he was, offering me a way back, offering us both a chance to rebuild. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "But I'm scared. I'm scared of what this could mean for us." He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But we can figure it out together." And in that moment I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could. As we sat there, hands barely touching, I felt something shift between us, not the uncertainty that had loomed over us for weeks, but a quiet, fragile hope. We didn't have all the answers, and maybe we never would. But for the first time in a long time, I realized that we didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the complications or the fear of what came next. What mattered was that we were willing to try, willing to face it together, no matter where it led us. I looked up at him, and he met my gaze, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. There were still questions, still unknowns, but the distance that had once threatened to tear us apart was no longer there. Instead, we were building something new, something that would take time, patience, and understanding, but something real. We didn't need to rush, we didn't need to force it. All we needed was each other. And in that moment, I knew that would be enough. As we left the cafe, the sun beginning to set behind us, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Whatever came next, we would face it together, one step at a time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that was enough.